This is Thailand. A conflict broke out in 2014 and hasn't ended. Prime Minister Prayut seized power in a coup in 2014 and in 2019 was able to cement his authority through parliamentary elections, of whose legitimacy is still in doubt. On top of that, Pro-Democracy Party was disbanded earlier this year, leading to street protests right here in the streets of Bangkok. Even after COVID-19 restrictions and strict anti-protest rules, the past few months saw tens and thousands of protesters dissenting against their government. But actually, the Bangkok protests started way before COVID lockdown. And it's only in the last 1 week that we saw the internet flooded with these pictures. And suddenly, everyone in the international media was talking about Bangkok protests.
In Thailand.
What was supposed to be just another student-led movement has now become a movement that's challenging the establishment in a way the country has never seen before. The core demands of the protesters are Prime Minister Prayut Chan-ocha and his government to resign, the constitution to be amended to be more democratic, and the monarchy reformed to make it more accountable. But what led to this change in the outlook of Thailand's long-standing political crisis, and why all of a sudden there has been such a massive rise in the scale of the protests? In the 5 months of this protest movement, it was the first use of ammunition and force on 17th of November that left 55 protesters injured. The police unleashed arms against the protesters who were trying to enter the parliament. The protesters were heading to the parliament to express the need for constitutional changes. To stop the raging crowd, police used tear gas, water cannons mixed with irritating chemicals. This violent clash went on for about 6 hours. Even though the move was designed by the police to slow down the momentum of protests, it resulted in the opposite. The next day observed larger crowds of protesters chanting on the streets. Different parts of Bangkok came up with different ways of resisting the current regime. From satires, raps to detailed speeches against the state were seen. This series of violence been perhaps the most prominent reason behind the rising scale of protests. The right next day, November 18, the Thai lawmakers were scheduled for a session in the parliament to vote on constitutional amendments. The parliament was proposed 7 constitutional reforms, and one of them included the monarchical reforms. Keep in mind that the monarchical reform to dilute the power of monarchy has been the core demand of the protesters. But in the end, the parliament decided to adopt 2 constitutional amendment proposals but totally backed down its support on the motion of monarchical reform. Basically, the members of parliament turned deaf ears to outraging dissent against the absolutist power of monarchy. This parliamentary move left the protesters feeling unacknowledged and disappointed. The constitutional amendments supposedly aimed to make the country more democratic were handpicked carefully enough to leave the monarchical powers untouched. Ongoing nationwide protests, Prime Minister Prayut threatened that all laws and all articles would be used against the protesters. Now, what did the Prime Minister mean by all laws and articles? What he was referring to in these lines is the most notorious article in Thailand's constitution, Article 112, the lèse-majesté law. So, up until this stunt, the Thai government was relied on charges of sedition and cybercrime to silence the critiques. The controversial Article 112 makes the royalty of Thailand untouchable by the people. It prohibits the criticism of Thailand's monarchy and makes it a punishable offense with a lengthy sentence of 15 years. So by the traditionalists of Thailand, the royal institution even now is regarded as the bedrock of national identity. When on November 25th, many leading political social activists in Bangkok openly questioned the King of Thailand, you can probably imagine how far the protesters went in challenging the national authorities. By shattering this long-standing taboo, The people of Thailand have made their progress on their path to democracy. The protest leaders believe that King Maha Vajiralongkorn holds more power and wealth than is appropriate under a constitutional monarchy. But every story has some dark turns, and this move followed exactly that for the democracy-supporting protesters of Thailand. Their worst fears came true. On the same day, authorities escalated their legal battle, charging 12 of the protest leaders with Article 112 against insulting the monarchy. The same day, supporters of the royalty, though a smaller crowd of traditional beliefs, were found beating protesters, chucking bricks into the crowd. Even gunshots were triggered by this set of people in some parts of Bangkok. These anti-democratic actions have came under heavy criticism on the internet.
We're not afraid to ask questions. We're not afraid to question authority.
The Bangkok protesters have gained digital support from the democracy supporters of Hong Kong and other parts of the Orient. The Thailand government has taken a very antagonistic role, with its hands covered in the blood of its own people. This standoff between the four democracy protesters and the military-inclined government has put the country in political turmoil. Only at the end of these protests can anyone tell if it's the democracy or the military-cum-monarchy that will rule. Nonetheless, with such undeterred protests, the people of Thailand have sent a clear message to government and the rest of the world that they will not be the puppets of the powerful anymore.